I'm going to show you how to make music in the style of Lane 8. I'm going to be doing the sound design for most of these sounds completely from scratch, so you'll be able to learn how to make the sounds and then how to implement them into the track to learn how to make music in this style. We'll write the track together and then I'll do some automation and then a quick arrangement. Lane 8 is a melodic house and progressive house producer with a signature style of uplifting melodies with subtle undertones of grit and energy. Although his music is simplistic by nature, it's actually quite complicated sometimes to make this style of music because there's a lot of complexities that you don't really hear on the surface, but without them, the music wouldn't sound half as good. I'm going to dive into some of those things in this video so that you can learn how to make music in the style of Lane 8. And one last thing, these videos are here to teach you, to educate you on how to make music in this style, but I really encourage you to carve out your own path and create music that is true to you, whatever that is. So if you want to download this project file, the stems, the samples, everything included, then you can click in the link in the description or in this card right up here. It works in Ableton 10, 11, and 12. For Lane 8 style of music, usually you need a kick and bass that is full and gritty sounding, but also really complements the rest of the melody of the track. The drums are usually pretty simple with tight hi-hats and old school sounding snares. And the synths, atmospheres, and effects are really where this track is going to shine, with nice analog sounding, moving lead sounds, beautiful chord progressions, pads, and atmospheres, and sometimes a nice vocal that's being used as a hook. The key of the track is A major and the tempo is 124 beats per minute. For the kick drum, I've layered up 2 of my new kicks that I just put out in a sample pack on Patreon. So there is a kick that is an F and there's one that's F sharp. The F kick is not in scale with A major. There's no F. There's an F sharp and there's E. So instead of being at F, I moved it down from F to E, moving it down 1 semitone, and this allows for the kick to be in the key of the track. You can also put it on the root note, which is what a lot of people do, but sometimes the overlapping frequencies get a little bit difficult to mix because the sub and the bass are hitting the same frequencies. So you can actually go up or down a few semitones so that they're not competing for the exact same frequencies, and your mix might gel a little bit better, but of course every track is different. I layered it up with a top end of a kick drum. So this sounds like the top. I cut out all the lows here. And then I pushed up this by 1 whole octave. So I get that nice snappiness. I heard in a lot of Lane 8 tracks, there is quite a bit of sharp top end, the snappiness to help it punch through the mix, as well as my kick here has a lot of strong mids in the body so that it helps it punch through the mix. Now I'm going to make a bass line, and the idea is that I want every layer of this song to feel like it's adding value to the overall emotion behind the song. So even the bass line, when I'm writing it, I want it to feel like it's capturing that emotion and it feels good to listen to. I'm going to design the bass first, and then we're going to draw in the actual melody. I'm going to make it all the synths from this video on Vital. I'm switching over to Vital because it's a free VST that anybody can download. It works on PC and Mac, and it's free. So why not go ahead and grab it so you can follow along for the rest of the video. I'll put a link in the description below. The sound itself, I'm going to make a sawtooth style bass. So I'll pull this down by 1 octave, turn this one on as well, and put them both to filter 1. So both oscillators are feeding in to this filter here. Pull down the resonance, and this is how it sounds. Put down an octave. It's already sounding like a nice full gritty bass, but I want to add a little bit of movement to that. So I'm going to throw on this random modulator onto the cutoff and pull it down a little bit. Maybe pull my cutoff down a little more. And that bit of movement just adds a little bit of variation and it makes it more interesting to listen to. But I'm not done yet. I'm throwing a chorus onto the bass, which makes it very stereo and it makes it feel wide and interesting and adds more movement, but it's dangerous because it can cause phase cancellation. So I want to make sure that I'm actually EQing out anything that could cause problems. I'll go to mid-side mode, change this to sides, and I'm going to cut out anything below like 200 hertz. Second filter on there, so we're really... And then of course I can check with utility to make sure that it still sounds good in both stereo and mono. And to me, that sounds fine. So I can go ahead and get rid of that utility. And now that bass sounds really full and wide. It has a cool amount of movement with the chorus. So let's go ahead and draw in the MIDI next. For the bass line, it's actually in a major scale. I know a lot of producers shy away from using major scales because they think that it makes their music sound too happy, but that's not actually the case. You can write more melancholic or emotional or even sad music in a major scale, and you can write happy music in a minor scale. It's all about how you actually write out the song. And I noticed in a lot of Lane 8's tracks, they were in a major scale, and it was because a lot of his music is very uplifting and it feels good to listen to. It makes you happy, but it doesn't sound overly happy or cheesy. It still sounds very emotional. So I wrote in the bass line in a major scale as well. One of the tricks that I learned from Lane 8 was this bass line that I've never actually used, but it is starting at the quarter note and then an eighth note and then another quarter note. You just duplicate this over, and that's the bass line. It's super simple, but it's super catchy because it hits the same time as the kick. I'm going to grab these ones and move them up. So I'll go up a little bit and then down. And these last two will go up again. Staying again in the major scale. And if you don't remember how to make a major scale, you can actually just go onto all the white keys. So from C major is all white keys and A minor is all white keys. So if I just draw out C, that's the major scale. And then I can move this up and down to whatever key that I'm in. So say I'm in F sharp. I can move that up to F sharp, and this will be my F sharp major scale. And if you're in Ableton 11 or 12, you can just use the scale function that comes with it. This bass line already captures some emotion. So when you feel like you've captured a bit of emotion in your bass line, maybe it's not so obvious right away. Maybe you have to come back and listen to a few other things first and keep changing it. But that's when I know that I can move on to the next step, when I feel like I can already hear a little bit of emotion and where the direction of this melody in this track is going. So for this bass width synth, I just duplicated over the MIDI. I'm going to duplicate the bass over chorus and the EQ. I'm going to duplicate all that over, and I'm just going to add this nice like top layer to the bass with a lot more width. So I'm going to cut out all the lows up to about 200. So not just the mids or the sides, but both. Got another filter to make sure I'm really cutting all that out. And I'm going to throw some reverb on there. And I want to throw a saturator to get some really nice grit out of that as well. And I like to put that before the EQ, so I'm not forgetting to EQ out after. Sometimes when you add saturation, it can actually add some low harmonics that you don't want. Yeah, see how much is there? I'm going to put on another filter. I'm going to put a ×4 down here. Just make sure I'm getting rid of all that low end. So I have this nice gritty top end to go along with my bass. Turn it down a little bit. And that just fills it up. You get that movement. Maybe we'll move the chorus a little bit so it's got a different speed. Maybe just change this a little bit. Change some settings here so it just sounds a bit different. And I'm happy with how the bass sounds already. I just need to throw some compression on both for some sidechain compression from the kick. Aiming for about 8 to 10 dB of gain reduction, and I can plop that on the bass width as well. Maybe even more gain reduction to give more of a swelling effect. By the way, I do offer music production coaching, so if you're looking to increase the quality of your music production, you can book one-on-one time with me over video calls, and we can look into your project files to see where you're struggling or to see where you could do better. Or if you're interested in learning at your own pace, I do have music production courses and masterclasses available as well. For more information to either of those, click the links in the description below, and let's get back to the video. Starting with the hi-hat, usually Lane 8 chooses a really sharp, punchy, clean hi-hat. So I have this one here, just some EQ cutting off the really sharp highs. Just a little bit ear piercing and then cutting out the lows. My snare, typically I find Lane 8 uses a lot of old school sounding big snares. So I have a 70s snare and this 90s snare. And I've added some EQ to cut out a little bit of the muddiness of the snares and layered them up and balanced the audio a little bit. And this snare itself has a bit of a weird tail. sounds like a distortion. So I've cut that out and faded that out. It's a really good idea to manipulate your samples to shape them to fit your track even better. Don't just always rely on throwing them in and seeing if they sound good. Maybe mess around with them a little bit, see if you can change the fade outs and the length of the sample to fit your track even better. Then I have my shaker here. It's a good idea to get some really nice shaker loops or to make your own. I have a video showing how to make your own shaker loops right here. It's a pretty extensive video showing how you can make really professional sounding loops. But if you don't want to make your own shaker loops, you can rely on a sample pack, and this one I'm using is by Bound to Divide. I'll put a link in the description below where you can get this sample pack, and it sounds like this. It's really great because it has a lot of variety in the shaker without being too off the timing and too swingy, but it adds a nice layer of complexity and it makes it sound super interesting. So all three together. And maybe the shaker is a little loud, so I'll turn that down a bit. Next, I want to send these each to a return track for my reverb. So the return track here, I'm going to grab a reverb and throw that on, 100% dry wet. Turn on the low cut. We don't need low energy reverb for the drums. Turn off the high cut so we have some high end of the reverb coming through. And then I want to turn up the pre-delay to about 20 or 30 milliseconds. This allows for a small gap between when the drum hits and when the reverb actually comes in. And I aim for about 700 to 850 or 900 milliseconds on my decay time. Solo my hat. I'm aiming for when I hear the reverb, but it's not sounding too obvious. It's just kind of cushioning and making that hat feel a little bit more comfortable in the mix. My snare, I'll probably put a little bit more reverb on this one because it's going to be more of an old school vibe. And lastly, the shaker. All three of those with the kick and the bass. I could throw a glue compressor onto the channel itself just to glue the drums together a bit. And I'm usually just want to push this up to maybe 3 or 10 milliseconds and the threshold bring down until I'm getting about maybe 2 or 3 dB of gain reduction. You'll see that the snare is jumping up pretty high. That's okay because the snare is obviously a little bit more peaky and strong, but on average, getting about 2 to 3 decibels of gain reduction is what I'm aiming for. Okay, so I'm going to jump into the synths now, but before I do, I want to let you know this is the third time I've had to completely re-record this due to technical difficulties that I didn't notice when sending it to my editor. It would mean a lot if you could click that like button and help this video reach more people, because this video has taken me 3 tries over the course of 2 weeks to completely redo it, move on to something else, and come back to re-record it. Let's jump into the synths. For Lane 8 style of music, there is a lot of melodic content usually in the sounds. Usually not too many layers, but the layers that are being used are usually really high quality, and they tend to have a lot of melody working with each other. So when the bass line changes and the chords change, it usually works really well with the melody, and it just all sounds very beautiful. So I'm going to try and capture that with a few different layers. The first is what I call the background candy, and this is just a synth that is going to be fluttering in the background, giving it some movement, giving it some professional quality, because it's going to be a lot of ear candy. It's going to be in the background, kind of, you're always listening and hearing this very subtle movement in the synths. So to do that, I'm going to grab Vital, and I'm going to start using Vital in some of my videos. So it's a free VST synth. It's very similar to Serum, so if you have Serum, or it's just very easy to follow along. But if you want me to cover more videos with Vital, please let me know in the comments if you would or if you would not like me to use Vital, so that I know for future videos to use this or to use something else. So this is the MIDI here. It's just a simple pattern of going 3 down and 1 up, but the first MIDI note is actually starting with only 2, and it sounds like this. It's at this like kind of trilling groove, and it sounds really rhythmic. So I'm just going to solo that, and first I'm going to go into Vital, and I'm going to swap out this for a different wavetable. So I'm going to choose a random sound here. Let's go, sure, no, let's go something a little bit different. Drink the Juice, sure. Let's see how that one sounds. I'm going to change this maybe a little bit. Get a bit more tonal, bright sound. And then I want to add some filtering to this, so I'll turn on my filter 1, change that to 24 dB, and bring this resonance down. I'll turn this into a pluck. So I'll bring the decay down and put this onto the cutoff. A little bit of release and bring the sustain down. Maybe I'll bring the octave down as well. It might be a bit bright. Doesn't sound very good yet, but the idea is that I'm going to add a lot of processing to this to make it feel very far in the background. So the next I'll grab an LFO. I'm also going to throw that on the filter, and this is going to give a bit of a moving, wafting effect. So I'll change this mode from trigger to sync, and then I'll change this from tempo to seconds. This is going to make it so that it's not repeating every time a note hits, but it's just going to continuously play that LFO, and this is the speed at which it's going to be oscillating. So now it's moving up and down. Let's dial in a little bit less of that LFO. A little bit less of the cutoff on the envelope. And because it's on a weird timing, it's actually not to the grid, which makes it even more interesting to the listener. Turning on oscillator 2, I'll bring that pitch down as well. Turn on the filter 2, 24 dB and resonance down. Envelope 2, same deal, make it more of a pluck. But I want this to be a little bit different than the first one. Change this to another random waveform here. Sure, doesn't really matter too much. And with this LFO, I'm going to add in as well to this filter and add just a little bit of a different amount. I'll grab LFO 2 and repeat the same process, turning on this LFO, and I'll change the trigger to sync again, but this time I'm going to choose a different timing, so maybe a little bit slower like this. Now both of those oscillators are working and they're moving separately, which is just going to sound really pleasant on the ear because it's going to be constantly changing and constantly fresh. Doesn't sound so great now, but I'm going to add in some EQ, cutting off the lows and the highs. This is a filter delay with a preset called Wanderer. And then I just have the dry turned up. And then I have some reverb. I think the sound has too much sustain. It's a little bit too obvious, so I'm going to pull down the filter even more. A little bit less sustain on here. I want it to be more like droplet sounding in the back, and then add it in the Wanderer again. And turn that volume down quite a bit. Let's hear that with the kick, bass, and the drums. I can pull down the decay time a little bit and some of the feedback, but overall it's adding a nice little textural kind of blipping drop water droplet sound in the background, and it's just pleasing to the ears because we're not really sure what it is, and our ears are kind of picking up on it, and it's gluing the whole track together. Especially when we add in these other layers, it's going to feel like it's gluing all the melodies and the melodic elements together. Speaking of gluing the track together, I also use this atmosphere to do that exact same thing. This atmosphere is something I recorded. Very easy to make. All you need to do is grab a synth of any type really and add on a reverb and then freeze that reverb. So I can try that with the background candy right here. So I can push that dry wet up to 100%, put in an audio track here, resampling, hit record, and then hit record. Once the reverb is playing, I click freeze. Turn the freeze off, turn the dry wet back down to what it was. And now you have this audio of a drone or a pad sound. You can add some auto panning, some filtering, anything you want to change it up a little bit, but overall it just sounds like a really nice drone. That's what I've done here with this atmosphere. It's a really good way of adding in just a nice tonal glue and texture to your sound. So I used more of a supersaw sound for this, but you can do this with any synth and usually it sounds really good. Just add on that reverb, freeze it, record it, and then you can use that as a textural pad in the background of your track. The lead sound is probably the most important sound of a Lane 8 style track. The leads carry the track and they work well against the bass lines, the chords, the piano, the strings, the pads. Basically, you want your lead and your other melodic elements to work together, and when they're changing notes, changing chords, or the melody itself is changing, you want those to work together to feel that beautiful melody. So I'm going to show you some things that you can do to get that within this style of music. So my bass line is actually quite important for this because my bass line notes work well against the melody. So when I'm writing my melody in, I like to play along with my bass line to make sure that it works well. The MIDI itself looks like this. I'll show you what it sounds like by opening up a Vital, and I'm just going to turn this into a pluck first before I show you what it sounds like, so it's not just a really aggressive sound. So I'll pull the sustain, so I'll go into envelope 2, pull the sustain down quite a bit, pull the decay down to about 385, turn on the filter, 24, bring the resonance down, and then envelope 2 goes onto here, and I'll just bring that down quite a bit. Let's look at the MIDI. So this is the MIDI here, and with a lot of Lane 8's tracks, I noticed he would change the notes of the root and the middle and the higher notes of his arpeggios and his lead melodies to kind of keep you always guessing and to keep the melody fresh and exciting, and also using sometimes double notes like this. Just kind of throws you off a little bit and keeps you on your toes, and it makes it much more interesting when you don't know exactly where the melody is going to change, and these double notes do that same sort of thing. So let's go into the actual sound design of this. It's going to be a simple pluck because a lot of Lane 8 style, he uses really strong lead sounds, but they're either very modern and electronic and kind of gritty sounding, or they're very old school, analog, warm, or a combination of both. So I'm going to try and achieve that by layering up 2 different oscillators, one of a more analog sound and one of a little bit more digital, and then layering up a second lead, which is going to add a bit of movement and professionalism to this. So I'll bring the pitch down by 12 semitones, unison up a little bit, and bring this detune down quite a bit, otherwise it's going to sound trancy. So right away I want to make sure this pluck sounds really nice and warm, but I want to add a little bit of crispiness on the top, so I want it to be just a little bit open. So I won't bring this all the way down here, otherwise it's going to open up a lot and close a lot. I want it to open up from maybe about a third in. So when it's fully closed, it still has a bit of that kind of warmth. Like if I turn this off, I can still hear the note. So it's letting in a lot of those high frequencies. And the decay time is also important. And then a little bit of sustain with a little bit of release. And I want to make sure that if I'm increasing this release, I'm also increasing it on the amplitude. Otherwise, we're not going to hear it. Makes it feel less dry and cut. And I want to add just a little bit of movement on this cutoff as well with the LFO. So LFO 1, I'll throw on that cutoff, and just slightly, I want to go like this. And then maybe bring this down just a little bit. Change the trigger to sync again, and we can choose seconds again. The reason I'm lowering it here is that it opens up from a lower point. Maybe even a little bit lower, because this filter is opening with this LFO. And just that little bit of movement on the cutoff already makes it feel much more professional and much more interesting. I'm going to add in a second oscillator, turn on filter 2, change this to 24, bring the resonance down, and bring the filtering down. With this one, I want to choose something a little bit less analog sounding and a bit more digital sounding. Let's choose Drink the Juice. It's a weird sounding name. Let's take a listen. Octave down. And I want this to sound like a very thin sound, just like a thin layer. So I'm going to add some harmonic stretch. Exactly. Bring the level down a little bit. And this is just something I heard Lane 8 do in some of his tracks. He has this kind of, like I said, more digital sound, which is usually not desired, but if you do it properly, it can really help to kind of match the style of the track. Turn on the filter with envelope 2 joining in on the filter as well. This one I'm going to open up even more. And LFO on there as well. Maybe a little bit less volume, and then oscillator 1 back on. A little bit more volume. It's a little bit sounding like a bell. That's better. I want it to sound more tinny, more like a kazoo. And this just gives the pluck more character, so it doesn't sound just like another pluck made from a sawtooth. Maybe I could even put some LFO on the volume itself. Maybe slow this down a bit. Adding that bit of variation really elevates the lead sound itself. Now I want to add some reverb and delay. I can add it to the sound itself, and I'll do that first. But it kind of muddies up the track a little bit, so I'm actually going to use a return track. So with this, I'm going to send this into the return track 2 and move that reverb onto the lead return track. Then I'm going to add a delay. I'm going to push my delay up 100% and then my feedback down a little bit. Change this so it's 3 and 5. So that it has 2 delay signals back and forth. And then I'm going to add a bit of decay time, low cut off. I can open up a bit more. And I want to add a bit of pre-delay so that the plucks themselves have a bit of room before the reverb actually comes in. But this is going to sound much better. I want to actually swap out the dry wet of the delay and the reverb because I want to have just a little bit of delay but a bit more reverb. So I'll put the dry wet of the delay to 30 and the dry wet of the reverb up. That to me sounds better. And lastly, I want to add in a compressor, and I want to make it so that the compressor is sidechain compressing from the lead sound and squishing the delay and reverb to make room for the original lead to come through and make it sound very punchy and clean in the mix. So I'll turn on the sidechain from the lead, take this threshold down, aiming for 3 to 5 dB usually. If I pull it down, you can really hear. I like this lead. It sounds a bit unique, and that's kind of what I was going for. It might not be the best sounding lead right now. It definitely needs some fine tuning, as a lot of these sounds do, but I encourage you to go in when you're writing music, and even when it sounds good like it does now, go back in and experiment with the sound. Try different things, try to fine tune even more, because in the short frame of this video, it's hard to get this sounding exactly how I want and as good as I want. It takes a lot of time to fine tune those exact measurements of the sound, but I just encourage you to go in and try this yourself, because a lot of the time you can make it sound even just a little bit better. Next, I'm going to add 2 free plugins. They're called Pitch Drift, another one called Magic Switch. Pitch Drift actually will move the pitch up and down very slightly, which gives it a bit more of an analog feel. Obviously too much, I'll dial in just like 10%. And Magic Switch, I'm not exactly sure what it's doing, but it sounds like it's compressing it and adding a bit of chorus. Just makes it feel nice and warm and analog. Subtle additions like this aren't making a huge difference, but it is adding a little bit of extra quality, which is sometimes the hardest bit to squeeze out of a sound. Just that extra 1 or 2%. These plugins and these little things that you can do are sometimes all you need to really bring the quality that you're struggling with up that last few percent. I'm gonna add a little bit of saturation, just slightly. It is a pretty raw sound, so I'll put this before the magic switch and the EQ. Now I want to go in with some EQ and just carve out some of the areas of the lead that are going to make it sound a bit tinny, a bit low quality, and a bit muddy. So right here we have this kind of nasally sound. Maybe I can adjust a little bit of that. To me that sounds a little bit better, and I can push up maybe a little bit of the high end. Reduce a bit of the muddiness, and cut out the lows that we don't need. Let's listen before and after using the EQ. Very subtle. Maybe I can push up the scale feature a little bit and add a bit more intensity to all that. Still a little bit muddy to me. That sounds better. The last thing I want to do to this sound is add a little bit of key tracking in the filters. So if I turn this up, it means that the higher pitched notes in the MIDI are going to play with even more open cutoff. Just adds even more variation to the sound. By the way, now is a good time to like the video if you learned something already, because it helps out the channel tremendously. Now what I'm going to do is duplicate this lead sound to beef it up a little bit and give it just this lower layer with a bit of variation and modulation on the sound to make it sound even more professional. So quickly just going to duplicate over this lead, turn off the send for now so I can focus on the sound, and I just want to cut back on both of the cutoffs. And I want to add this LFO to the attack of the envelope on the amplitude. And bring up that attack a little bit myself. I don't want this to be a pluck sound, more of like a wafting sound. Speed up the LFO. Add some more LFO on the actual filtered sounds. And then I want to pull out that really low bass note with the EQ. Just kind of a weird sound. Let's try with some effects here, maybe some chorus. Some distortion. It's not the best sound, but the idea is that it's just kind of adding a little bit of a gritty layer underneath the main lead. So I can dial that in with some volume. I'll disable this send as well so I can just focus on the sound. Maybe turn it up a little bit here. You can try this with a bunch of different things. Like I can just mess around with this a lot, get a very unique sounding layer, and just dial in a little bit of volume just to make that lead sound have a layer of a little bit more power behind it, just kind of doubling up the sound and just using some of the frequencies that are overlapping, but then changing it so that it is adding a bit of variation and modulation. It just is a way to make the sounds feel like they're not just so stagnant and repetitive, but have this kind of underlying ear candy that you don't really know what it is, but it is making it sound a bit different and more interesting. To make this lead sound even more interesting throughout the entire track, I'm going to add some automation to the cutoff itself. So I'm going to go into my lead, configure, choose the filter here and filter here, both are going to be their own separate automations. Filter 1 cutoff, show automation. And what I want to do is just draw in basically a straight line like this. That's going to be the baseline of this automation, just because now it's always moving. It's very humanized now. It's not just a straight line across. It always has a bit of movement. And then I want to add in some random dips and valleys. I'm going to hold Alt or the Command key, and I'm just going to draw in very smoothly some peaks and valleys here, just like this. Especially on the high notes up here, I want to open that up. And I'm just going to draw one here, maybe one here. And just by doing this, you're adding a lot of variation to the cutoff as well. Maybe we can go a little bit more intense on some of them. Maybe we can draw like that. And now we have variation throughout the whole sound. It's going to sound much more interesting. And I'm going to go into the filter 2 cutoff and show automation in a new lane and do the same thing here, but not follow the same path as the first one. And they're going to kind of cross over each other and be different filters going back and forth, making the sound even more interesting and more modulated. Moving on, next I have this vocal hook, and this is a really common thing that Lane 8 does in his tracks. He uses like little vocal snippets to create melody and rhythm. So I recorded myself, singing is a strong word, I recorded myself sort of saying these two phrases, and then I pitched them up. You can download vocal samples from Splice and LoopCloud and online, or you can try to record your own like I did here. And the way that I did it was just literally listening to the song and thinking of a bit of a rhythmic vocal sound that I can make that would work well with the track. And so this is just what I did. It worked well melodically, it was a bit rhythmic, and that's just what I was going for. And once I add some obvious processing like delays, reverbs, and EQ, this goes from sounding pretty bad to sounding pretty decent. So the EQ cutting out a lot of the lows and a lot of the low mids, the delay, and then a reverb with a pretty large decay time. So I recorded it and pitched it up so it would also sound a little bit more falsetto and a little bit brighter and more fitting with the rest of the track. You can play that with the lead sound. It also works well with the lead and the melody. Again, I'm paying attention when I'm writing these things, the leads, the vocals, the melodies, everything. I'm checking in with the rest of the track to see if it works well melodically with that. So if I play with the bass, and to me, that sounds good musically, so I'm going to move on to the next step. The last layer I did was strings, which also helps to glue it together and gives it more of a melody and more expression. So for this, I chose two synths. I have the Vital string, so if you have Vital and you want to use this, there's a preset called Analog Pad. Nice and warm pad. I also chose synthetic strings because I prefer that, and it's an Ableton preset, and it sounds like this. So for the synth strings, I have 3 different chords, and the thing with writing in a major or a minor scale is that a lot of producers don't realize that you don't have to stay within major chords for a major scale or minor chords for a minor scale, and actually you should be using both, but that's a whole different conversation. So don't be afraid to go from major to minor in your chord progressions and try different chord structures inside as well. So first I have this A major chord. Then I have this sort of strange chord. It's technically, it is an F sharp suspended 4th, but I took the F sharp and I pushed that up. Basically, it just is a major chord, F sharp major, but I moved the A sharp up another semitone. And then I pushed up the F sharp, so that is called an inversion of the note. And then lastly, I have this F sharp minor chord. So A major, F sharp suspended 4th, F sharp minor. Again, checking along the rest of the track to make sure that it works. And my advice for writing out chord progressions is start with a single note. So start with the A, go up to the B, go down to the F sharp. If that sounds good, add in a second note. and then a third note. It's much easier to try and write like this if you're not familiar with chords than trying to write all the chords one after the other. And you can even add in a fourth or a fifth note on top of this, add layers of octaves, etc. And just experiment and don't stress too much if they don't sound good at first. Just keep playing around, keep swapping out ideas and see what sounds better. Lastly, I just have a white noise generator using Operator so that I can add in my own white noise to the track. Some reverbs and delays to make it a little bit more interesting, and some EQ cutting out all the extra lows and highs that I don't need. We're gonna listen to this full track now from beginning to end. If you wanna download this project file with the arrangement and the mix down, then you can click the link in the description below, which brings you to my Patreon, which is also the best way to support me on this channel and keeps me making more videos like this one. If you like this video, make sure to check out the playlist right here, which shows a bunch of other videos on how to make music like in similar styles, or click this video right here, which YouTube selected just for you based on your algorithm preferences.